A warm welcome to WBC and all of our guests today on DEI Driving Change, Global to Local. And please use the chat to introduce yourself, for comments and for questions. So we will begin in 2 minutes as we're giving everyone time to dial in. Hello to the US and to those from Europe, and to say thank you. These are trying times, and we are so pleased with Dr. Rohini Anand, chair of our diversity initiative of WBC, and the focus of her book on going from global to local, and today LGBTQ plus, with all of you as we learn and change. Please introduce yourself as you join in the chat, and we look forward to a rich and compelling discussion toward action. Good morning. As you continue to join, introduce yourselves in the chat. A welcome from WBC and our global committee, and our real focus today on driving change with LGBTQ plus. We will begin in 30 seconds. Please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat and give us your comments. And what we say is thank you to those that are champions and change leaders as we do that with collective action. Well, good morning. I'm Edie Fraser, CEO of WBC. I think we all want to stop and think with our heads and hearts about what's going on in Ukraine, and how touched we all are for knowing people and for keeping our values and support, but our hearts are heavy. And whatever we can do, because each one of us joining this call can tell the stories of how we're impacted, not only with our companies, with our friends. Someone called me from Ukraine last night because they felt particular discrimination now because they were gay. And so how appropriate today that we just say, we will rise up above horror and tyranny to the best of our abilities, and to say how pleased we are to host this panel with Dr. Rohini Anand, and all of you who have read her book and know Rohini. It is our joy to know the tenets of change, and not only take it local, but transform as leaders. And how lucky we are today to have 4 companies that are strident and strong as they present with Rohini, and Johnson & Johnson and CBRE and IBM and Sodexo. We praise you for teaching us so much. And then and again, as you read Rohini's book and read about Barclays and Barilla and the case studies of LGBTQ, the ERGs, and the examples that she provides specifically to this subject. We thank you, Rohini. It is our pleasure to introduce you to our global chair and the committee, and that is Heidi Kleinbach-Sotter. Heidi, with you, thank you for driving the change that you do from our global committee, from taking it from global to local. And with that, Heidi, we would like very much for you to introduce the committee and then introduce Rohini to all. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Edie, also for your kind words regarding the disastrous situation here in Europe. I think I will also speak for Anya and myself. We're both located and headquartered in Europe, and so is Carolyn, one of our co-chairs. Very, very heavy and very, very difficult times here. I just came back from a meeting in the Nordic countries, specifically our colleagues in Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. They're just very much frightened. So thank you for your kind words, and I'm sure everybody will do everything to help everybody in Ukraine, but unfortunately it looks like that it's going to expand, so also in the countries beyond. Okay, that was a heavy introduction, but a big welcome from the WBC global team to everyone on the call today. We have close to 200 registrants, so a great sign that the topic, localizing a global LGBTQ+ strategy, is of absolutely tremendous relevance to our WBC champion companies, especially if they are operating on a multinational or even a global level. Edie has kicked us off. I would love to introduce you to my co-chairs, and actually I'm going to ask my co-chairs to say a couple of words of introduction, maybe also a few words about why this topic is so relevant for their organizations and their brands. So we have Anya Skortseva. Anya is the Managing Director of Autolus UK and Europe and headquartered in the UK. And then we'll have Johanna Zylstra, who is the CEO of GenderFair, headquartered in New York. And Caroline Frankham, the CEO of the Profiles Division of Kantar. She's headquartered in London. She will join us 30 minutes later today because she has a previous obligation with Kantar. So Anya, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Heidi. So I'm Anya, I'm the Managing Director in Autolus. We're an executive search firm that's really been committed to driving inclusion in business for the last 11 years. And really all the intersectionalities of inclusion. And I think LGBTQ+ is one area that often gets forgotten and overlooked in organizations because visibly it doesn't look diverse. So we always bring up this topic of conversation with all of our clients. And as Heidi mentioned, I mean, even if you look at Europe, Europe has so many different countries. And actually the issue of LGBTQ+ inclusion is incredibly important and really varied from country to country in the way everybody's being treated. So we've been championing this subject and having these conversations with companies for the last 11 years. And we also actually do these wonderful role model lists in the media celebrating the out and proud leaders in business globally, as well as the future leaders and the advocates in the community. So really, really important topic, and yeah, delighted to be part of this panel today.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Johanna Zylstra, or Jose. I'm the CEO of GenderFair. We independently rate companies on metrics that were derived from the UN Women's Empowerment Principles. We look at leadership numbers and opportunities in the pipeline. We look at employee policies. We look at advertising. And then we also look at diversity reporting, which is very important for companies to be very transparent on their workforce composition, including LGBTQ employees. And then we look at social impact. We're excited to launch next week on International Women's Day in Europe, starting in France. So we'll share that information with you shortly. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Hannah. Today's deep dive session of diversity and sexual orientation is of great importance to many internationally operating companies. and the event will make a significant contribution to delivering insights into how global companies localize their global LGBTQ+ strategies. These learnings will help maximize benefits for their employees, brands, business, and communities in many countries around the world. Today is the second of 4 deep dive sessions. The first took place last December with a focus on localizing a global gender diversity strategy. And we had speakers from Mercedes-Benz, formerly known as Daimler, they just changed their name, IBM, Sodexo, and L'Oreal. They shared their approaches, whereas today we are totally focused on how to localize global strategies with respect to sexual orientation. We will hear from 4 global companies. Edie has already mentioned them: Sodexo, Johnson & Johnson, IBM, and CBRE. They will share their approaches, they will share their successes, their learnings. I'm very sure that they will also share their pain points. We are planning for another 2 sessions for the remainder of this year. One is going to be on localizing a global race and ethnicity strategy, and the last one is going to be localizing a global disability strategy. So stay tuned for the dates to be confirmed. As our global subject matter expert, we're fortunate to have one of the leading experts on D&I with us for all 4 events, Dr. Rohini Anand. While Rohini is going to introduce the speakers, I will introduce Rohini. Rohini, it is my distinct honor to welcome you. We are incredibly fortunate to have you lead us through this topic. Rohini actually does not need a lot of introduction. Many of you will know Rohini for many years, some of you probably even for decades. He's regarded as the global subject matter expert on this topic. Rohini has had a truly impressive career as Sodexo's Chief Diversity Officer and SVP of Corporate Social Responsibility, with impressive impact on Sodexo's transformational change. Under Rohini's leadership, Sodexo has been featured as a best-in-class case study by no other than the Harvard Business School, titled Shifting the Climate of Diversity. Rohini has released her new book last December called Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. At the book launch, Rohini has been introduced by the Honorable Carrie Domingos from the US Department of Labor as a unique leader with a lasting contribution and a leading authority in D&I. I think that speaks for itself, Rohini. I am now handing over the baton to Rohini, and again, thank you for guiding us through this global event series. We could not be more happy to listen to you and the amazing speakers and your impressive insights to have. Take it away, Rohini.
Thank you, Heidi, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. That was a wonderful, very generous and gracious introduction. But I'm here with the panelists to learn from them as well, because these panelists are absolutely awesome, as you'll experience in just a minute. So we have, the 4 companies represented, but what's more important is the 4 individuals who are here from representing those 4 companies are fabulous. So we have AJ, who's here, and AJ is Senior Director of Digital Experiences for Sodexo. He actually joined Sodexo as an intern and is still there. He stayed, and when I was at Sodexo, he was very much of a champion of DEI and really supported the transformation journey. So welcome and thank you for being here, AJ. We have Elizabeth, who is here she's VP of CBRE. I've known her for many years, admired her, respected her. Just the work she's done in this space has been phenomenal. Many of you may know her for having created the Corporate Equality Index, which has really sort of transformed the space for the LGBTQ community. So welcome, Elizabeth. And I always learn listening to you. Just before, when we were chatting, I said, I'm going to quote you on that. So it's a pleasure to have you back here. Erica is here from IBM, and she's Director of Research Alliances. And a wonderful fact that I learned about Erica is that she has performed publicly as a classical music singer. So we're going to have that at the end of this panel. We're going to have you sing. And then we have Zach, who's here from J&J, and he's a communications leader for the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. Just an extremely, extremely important role, particularly around issues of healthcare disparities, and I know that's his real passion. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Rutgers and at Towson University. So welcome to all of you. What I'd like to do is to just set a little bit of a context very briefly so that we can get started. So essentially, we've talked about my book, and given the sort of complex and the dynamic nature of global work, there's really no checklist or there's no playbook, and best practices are really not enough. So each time that, I've done this global work, what I have found is that we really I found these sort of 5 principles that were provided a through line for this work. And these 5 principles are simple, yet they're very disruptive, and they can be applied with sensitivity to any cultural context. The foundational mistake that I found is that, very often we tend to replicate what's worked in one part of the world in other parts of the world, and that really doesn't resonate. And what the principles allow us to do is to really tailor and customize them regardless of the context that you're in. So they're simple, but they really do speak volumes and are disruptive. So the first one of those is make it local. And this speaks to the fact that, diversity transformation or change efforts have to be contextualized in the local context, the laws, the culture of a particular location. And, the history. And while doing that, understanding that, pushing for change. So oftentimes we get the question that, what can we do in LGBTQ plus unfriendly countries? And we know that there are, over 70 countries where it's illegal, homosexual activity is illegal, and in 13 it's punishable by law, by death. So, and in the book, I have examples from Singapore and Uganda, which are really not LGBTQ friendly countries. But the point here is sort of understanding the history and the context while pushing for change. So it is about disrupting the status quo, but doing it in partnership with local change agents. The second principle is leaders change to lead change. And we know that we need leadership at the top if we're going to have any sustained transformation, to take it from sort of performative actions to sustainable progress. But when leaders lead with that purpose and passion, and they internalize the benefit of diversity, equity, and inclusion to themselves and to the organization, that's when we know that we can get sort of sustainable progress. And oftentimes this takes a disruptive experience. So in the book, I have some strategies of how to, and one of those disruptive experiences I have found is really getting them to sponsor LGBTQ employee resource groups. And very often getting those that are most resistant, maybe sort of a pairing that is not obvious. And I know that in one instance, it was definitely not obvious to the LGBTQ ERG and also to the leader who was assigned as a sponsor. But when that leader left the company, he said to me that the most impactful experience he had had was sponsoring the LGBTQ ERG. So it really did shift his perspective. The third principle is, and it's good business too, and we know that 70% of change efforts fail when there isn't a strong change narrative, but that change narrative has to be embedded within the purpose and the business of the organization. And Zach, I know you're going to speak to a lot of that around healthcare disparities. But in one of the other examples that I shared is Barclays Bank, and Edie mentioned that. And Barclays Bank wanted to be in the UK the most inclusive bank for the LGBTQ plus community. And they did that. They branded themselves as such, and it really benefited the business. So it really was, part of how they led their business strategy. The fourth principle is go deep, wide, and inside out. Where organizations are made of these interconnected systems, and we have to embed DEI both internally and in the external ecosystem. And lastly, know what matters and count it. So, data and metrics really can be instruments of change, but they have to be localized, and they have to be, teams have to be held accountable. So these are the 5 principles, and the panel are going to really share sort of experiences that will illustrate each of these principles. But before we go there, let me just ask each of you this first question, which is, can you share one thing that you have found most challenging for you in doing global LGBTQ transformation work? And one thing that you're proudest of in your career as it relates to LGBTQ plus equity. You can do both or either one of those. So I'm going to start with, let me start with Erica. Erica, if I can start with you.
All right, thank you, Rohini, and I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you for the kind introduction. So I would say what's most challenging, this is choosing one of anything is always hard for me, but I will choose a representative. So one thing that's challenging is, I think, the volunteer nature of representing and leading within the corporation on LGBTQ plus diversity and inclusion. So I serve as one of our executive council co-chairs, and not just in this role, but all the roles and activity before. And I think hopefully others relate to this as well. We call it the day job and the gay job. And what I find challenging is that I care so deeply about the work, but I often, because it's my evening and weekend time, I often feel like I can't even meet my own standards of, engaging and investing at a level that matches, my commitment and connection to the subject matter. So I have always found that challenging.
That's great, Erica. Were you going to say something else? Sorry, did I interrupt you?
Oh, I was only going to add something I'm proud of.
Absolutely, go ahead.
All right, so one thing that I am proud of is elevating the awareness of intersectionality within IBM. I recall attending one of our out executive annual strategic planning sessions. This is now maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And the executives get to put up the things that we want our community to focus on and drive progress and change on in that following year. And one of the things I put up there was intersectionality and intersectional inclusion. And I remember a key response at that time by some participants was, what is intersectionality? So fast forward 3 or 4 years later, and intersectionality was included in the LGBT plus Innovation Jam last year that we co-hosted with Out and Equal, and it was featured prominently in the IBM Institute for Business Values, Striving for Authenticity, LGBT plus views on enduring discrimination and expanding inclusion. And so it's a work in process, but I am very excited about the fact that we are past the point of what is intersectionality.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. And I know that everyone on this call is going to be able to relate to this fact that, this is something you're passionate about, but you have to do it in the evenings and weekends. There are organizations now that are actually making the ERG leaders a paid position, which I think is terrific. So I think there's sort of some breakthroughs happening there. And this whole notion of intersectionality, I think Edie started off when she talked about Ukraine and the discrimination against the LGBTQ Ukrainians. I mean, this is really, we've got to take that intersectional lens to whatever we do. And there's one thing that I will mention, I meant to talk about this, I mentioned it up front, but in the chat, I saw that individuals were really introducing themselves and where they were based on Native American lands. And thank you so much for doing that, because that's something that we overlook very often. So thank you to those that are introducing themselves with the Native American lands that they're sitting on. So thank you, appreciate that. Okay, so let me go to you, Zach, and ask you the same question in terms of challenges and what you're proudest of.
Sure, Rohini, thank you so much. There are many things I'm proud of. I'll maybe start by highlighting a challenge. My role in our employee resource group called Open and Out. On the leadership team, I'm responsible for communication and for health equity. And so I'm a professional communicator by training, but certainly when you are communicating and responsible for communication around an issue and a topic in a community that you identify so closely with, where the issues are so personal, and you're responsible for crafting communications when there are public policies being passed in states in the US or public policies that discriminate against people around the world, when there are very specific incidents of hate speech or hate crimes or conflicts that are happening, that I am responsible for shaping our message, informing our leaders. It can be a very emotionally exhausting process. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to help craft the language and help communicate empathy and care and love and support and confidence and trust to our LGBTQIA community worldwide. And at the same time, I'm sure we can all agree that when we're called on in those moments to help inform narrative and messaging and such from leaders, it can be quite an exhausting and challenging process for the individual. But I do feel very privileged to have the gift of communication and the platform within a company like J&J to be able to help affect that sort of change and support our colleagues around the world. I'll say that one of the things I'm most proud of, I'll tee this up for later in our conversation, is an initiative that we've recently launched called Open and Out Labs at Johnson & Johnson. And it is our initiative that is bringing business investment along with employee lived experience and insights from our 4,000 person employee resource group, 94 chapters around the world, to help address LGBTQIA health equity. And it goes beyond the traditional model of philanthropic dollars or marketing dollars, things that are important, and really encourages business investment in researching and addressing some of the root causes of health inequity for LGBTQIA folks. We were able to get that off the ground in a soft launch last year, and now it is public and out there in the world. And one thing that I'm certainly really proud of, marshaling business investment in addressing some of these healthcare issues that our community faces.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm hearing this sort of a trend here around the challenges, right? It's exhausting, it's gratifying, you have passion, but it is exhausting and you have to take care of yourself as well. And yeah, we'll get to the Open and Out Labs in a couple of minutes, because I know people are going to want to hear about that, and it's just such an important initiative, so thank you. AJ, I'm going to go to you, same question.
Yeah, thanks, Rohini. So I think for just staying on that trend of the challenges first, I think it's speed and progress. I think we all have aspirations to do all this great work, but we're really finding not to boil the ocean and be more methodical in what we're trying to do. And I won't steal Elizabeth's quote from earlier, but it really is a strategic approach in what we're trying to accomplish. Just going back to Erica's comment on volunteerism as well, we're balancing so many initiatives, and then going back to that not boiling the ocean. Where are we going to really put that effort of those hours we have available? So we're more strategic in doing what we're doing. So I think when you get into the rewarding part, what we've really tried to focus on this past 2 years on our Global Pride team is really elevating LGBTQ plus leaders and amplifying their voices. We've got a lot of employees who are just beginning their career. They're coming out in a great environment with Sodexo. But how do we make sure that they're on a trajectory for talent? And that's where we've tried to put some effort in tracking against it. And then the coalition with some of our partner EBRGs, we've done some amazing work with our partners at Soul. And that's really helped us build some programming around Hispanic Heritage Month and how Pride and Soul can partner to do some really great programming. So we're building those bridges so they're more concrete and we can work collectively towards our diversity initiatives, rather than just being in those silos. So I think those are some of the rewarding parts that we've really put into place these past few years.
Awesome, AJ. So really talking again about being intentional about what you decide to do, given the limited bandwidth that everyone has. And then I think you build really nicely on Erica's point about intersectionality, because as the ERGs, employee resource groups, partner across employee resource groups, you really are tapping into the intersectionality of identities, because every one of those groups have LGBTQ stakeholders in them. So that's awesome. Thank you. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to you. Same question, and take it away. I think, Elizabeth, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm going to speak from the perspective of my adult work overall. CBRE is a fascinating work in progress, but I think the most challenging context globally when you are trying to introduce change is when you end up in an interstitial war of values, not so much between local values and corporate values of whatever company you're at, but actually interstitial American wars on values. So I'll give you an example. Uganda, there has been a huge scale investment by evangelical churches, born-again churches, into Uganda, into local churches, into infrastructure. And over time, they have gained a lot of trust in that country. Well, to go in and attempt to change the laws in Uganda, you don't just have to overcome whatever the kind of cultural roots that are intertwined in terms of the various sort of sectors of Uganda, but you also have to overcome this other set of American values around homosexuality, for example, being, categorized, triple underscored as an extreme sin and as sort of the very kernel of what could bring down civilization. The same played out in India, Rohini. I know you know this, where it was really important to frame the discrimination laws there as a vestige of colonialism. So it's those interstitial Western value wars that are played out on foreign soil. It's almost like you're then in a triangulation between those three concepts: local, American versus American.
Interesting. Very interesting, Elizabeth. And I think we're going to unpack that a little more, because I think you've put a really sort of nuanced point to this work. So I think we need to really discuss that a little more. So thank you very much for that. So Zach, I'm going to sort of ask you about this sort of the first principle, which is make it local. Can you talk a little bit about how you've localized your LGBTQ strategy while making it safe for your employees to be out in different parts of the world? Can you speak to, some sort of examples of that?
Absolutely. So we have the privilege at J&J of having a very large and globally dispersed presence for our employee resource group. I mentioned 94 chapters. We're in every region in almost every country that J&J operates in around the world. And there have been a few things that at a global level have helped to, I think, support local presence and safety and support for our colleagues. The first has been identifying regional sponsors, not just regional chapter leaders or regional coordinators, but business sponsors and business leaders who have taken on the responsibility of advocating for LGBTQIA colleagues, communities, supportive employee policies, and so forth all around the world. And we're linked through our extended leadership team. And of course, we collaborate quite closely on things, but having sponsors who are business leaders in their region, their operating company, embedded locally and helping to be that face and voice and agent for change has been a really important part of advancing progress and opening new chapters in places like China and Puerto Rico and elsewhere that we've had some challenges in the past, maybe getting off the ground. So really active sponsors, executive sponsors working with local and regional chapter leaders. The other piece is being consistent around what we are prioritizing from the center, and at the same time giving regions and local chapters different ways to adapt that to meet their needs, right? So for instance, Pride, we celebrate Pride, we call it Care with Pride in the US. It's led out of North America. It's one of our flagship programs for the last 11 plus years. It combines activation with retailers and digital activation, influencer partnerships, employee celebrations, marching in Pride parades, but that is shaped in a very US-centric kind of a lens. Our employees in some parts of the world are not going to be marching in Pride parades, but at the same time, what we do, we pull together a toolkit, we pull together a resource guide, we create the content, the material, the messaging that then our local chapters, the communication partners locally can adapt to fit the local need context, political need and necessity, cultural context, language, and so forth. And in doing that, we're giving guidance, we're creating the moment of unity around Pride for all of our employees worldwide, but at the same time, empowering our local colleagues to adapt it for whatever that might be. I'll also say that in terms of creating safe spaces, we have, I think, done a pretty good job of balancing the global need for centering the values and really our values driven from our credo and respecting the dignity and diversity of our employee workforce with things like our Restroom for All initiative, where every Johnson & Johnson facility worldwide now does have at least one restroom for all, non-gendered restroom, where any employee, guest, contractor, visitor can feel comfortable not having to choose between a binary when they're going to the restroom. But at the same time, we are working with local facilities management, we're working with local communication leaders, employee comms leaders to help roll that out and explain it in a way that is understandable, approachable, and ultimately welcomed by our local employee base. So if you are the one person at your site that chooses to use a restroom for all, you're not feeling isolated or othered. There's been a communication plan and a communication rollout to help support that. So it has been, I think, this balance of really being clear and solid in our convictions as to what is important, driven by our credo, driven by our values, driven by the global nature of our employee resource group, but being thoughtful, empathetic, responsive with the way that we communicate that locally, with how we empower local chapter leaders, local communication partners, and then ensuring that in every step along the way, we have the support of our global sponsors, our regional sponsors, our local sponsors, and other key business leaders who can help to embed some of this work in our chapters worldwide.
Yeah, that's really perfect, Zach. So really, you're talking about the values, and those values are consistent regardless of where you are. But what I loved is the way you explained, in the book, I talk about this sort of transversal and universal model. So universal is when there is some consistent application top down. And the example that I give is a food delivery company based in the US. And what they did with the best of intentions is to communicate out a LGBTQ banner during Gay Pride Month. And the intention was that this is, it's a safe company for everyone, regardless of where you are. Now, the employees in Egypt were very reluctant to display that because they have had to hide their identity for their safety because of the laws in Egypt. Yep. So, sending it out consistently without the guidelines, without the communication can really backfire. And what you've used is sort of this transversal model, right? Where you've got certain consistent frameworks and guidelines that you mentioned, but the application is very local, and you allow that localization. Go ahead.
Absolutely, Rohini. And I think, as a communicator, like someone once said, I love this, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so we can listen twice as much as we speak. An important part of that is listening genuinely and authentically to the feedback that we're getting from our local teams. When someone says to us, hey, this global email that you sent out, this word, if it shows up in my inbox, could get me in trouble. That's really important feedback for us to take to heart, to adapt and figure out how we then communicate in the transversal way that can be adapted and lifted up regionally appropriately, but does not put the safety of our employees or their families or their loved ones at risk anywhere in the world.
Yeah, so I love the safe space as a restroom for all, which is sort of a universal top-down piece, but the way you've localized it, based on the communications and how you package is phenomenal. So thank you for that. So there's ways of doing it. So I'm going to turn to you, Elizabeth. Now, you added this other nuance in terms of Western values in the local context. So you can, sort of speak a bit more to that. But, when we talked before, you had shared examples of companies where they sort of understood the local context and still were able to disrupt the status quo. And that's the point I want to make is, localizing does not mean accepting the status quo. It means, understanding it, but partnering with local change agents to disrupt that, right? So if you can talk a little bit about sort of companies that may be at odds with what the local environment or the laws of culture, and what they can do to push for change. If you can speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I think I think you're operating at a couple of levels. And this is my point of view as a general counsel. When I general counsel of Claris, which is the Apple software subsidiary, I was head of litigation at Apple at the time as well. And look, there's no way around it. My philosophy, and I think this somewhat comports with yours, Rohini, is that it's one company and it's one set of values.
Yeah.
And regardless of where you're operating, that set of values has to be operational.
Right.
But it puts you in a situation where I cannot tell you the number of times as general counsel, I've had to try to orchestrate getting an employee out of their home, if it was a woman, or finding where this gay employee ended up in the middle of Saudi Arabia, so that we can try to get safe haven. To me, like there's a kind of a measurement for every CEO, because I think we're in a very fascinating period of an awakening of CEOs over the last couple of decades, where CEOs are willing to take much riskier steps on social issues and to protect their employees than they ever could have imagined when they were at business school. So we've got this new behavior coming out of CEOs. And to me, I would think of it as a resistance quotient. So they were in Nazi Europe in World War II. To what extent would they be part of the resistance or the French resistance? To what extent would they take risks to literally now save employees that have gotten into the crosshairs of local law versus corporate value? And honestly, I think you have to be willing, and hopefully more and more CEOs will do this. You have to be willing to a little bit operate in the shadows to and literally save employees in some situations. You should be, every HR and leadership team should know exactly where the US Embassy is, know exactly the laws that pertain to refugee status, in case you literally need to take your employee to safe haven at an embassy. So and be prepared to hire local counsel. A company expense, but it's a value. So I cannot tell you how many times in the US and in other settings, we've literally secured counsel to help that employee out of a bad family situation. In one case at Claris, I had a kidnapping. The mother had literally kidnapped her child out of Texas and was hiding at Claris with that child in Mountain View area. So what did we do? Yes, we had to respond to the FBI, but then we immediately hired her local counsel in Texas. So some of these steps are bizarre and extraordinary, and you wouldn't want to put it in your employee handbook. But the fact is that you're living and operating around the margins, and those corporate values may cause you to do things that don't seem very businesslike, necessary to protect humans in your employ.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, I'm absolutely aligned with the fact that you have one company values regardless of where you are. So yes, you can contextualize, the work that you're doing, but your values are your values. And I would agree that I think companies and CEOs and leaders are taking more and more risks today than they ever have. Part of that, Elizabeth, is pressure from stakeholders, right? Employees are putting pressure on organizations. You have Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z basically saying, we want companies to do the right thing. We want purpose-driven organizations. The other interesting point you raised was about the shadow piece, right? Because it's not always obvious to all employees what the CEO, the leadership is doing. And it may mean operating behind the scenes without making this sort of, big splash. So I think that's terrific in terms of how you can navigate these landscapes where company values sometimes bump up with what's happening in the ground, and how you can continue to disrupt that status quo, because that's something we get all the time, question that I get all the time.
Yeah.
So sort of pivoting a little bit from there to you, AJ, clearly, this has to be driven from the top. You also need champions within the organization. And this, the principle that I have, go deep, wide, and inside out. It is about embedding the organization with allies and champions and ambassadors of this work. And I know that, you and Global Pride have spent a lot of effort creating these allies and champions within the organization. Can you speak to what you've done and the impact and maybe some examples of that?
Yeah, thanks, Rohini. So I have the pleasure of chairing the US Pride Group and co-leading our Global Pride Group. So we have that scale where we can really tap on some of our resources in our mature regions. One of the things we did was take those global strategic pillars that we built out from the dimension overall. So our sexual orientation and gender identity dimension has that strategic roadmap, and we try to embed DE&I in everything that we do. So I was jotting down notes from Zach and Elizabeth so far, some just great pieces I want to take back to our own team. But we really try to drive that culture of inclusion. So we do our leadership trainings. We have our employee practices like our EBRGs that are in all of our accessible to all of our employees, our teams, but really making sure that there's those advocates and those allies, because we don't always have a seat at the table as an LGBTQ+ person. Sometimes it's those allies being our proxy. So we have in our Global Pride Network, our global CFO, our global chief growth officer, as well as our executive sponsors. Here in the US, we have a global CEO of Integra, our VP of diversity. So those are really great allies that help infuse us and have a seat at the table to really ensure that our voice is being heard. And then we infuse that into that leadership journey. So you heard me earlier talk about really wanting to make sure we're mentoring our more junior employees, our teams that are on their career trajectories, and really infusing it with pro-human. So we try to cascade that across all the levels of the organization to drive that inclusive leadership. So we've partnered with FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, to really be one of those guiding principles as well. So throughout the organization, regardless of the dimensions, we're trying to instill that inclusion mindset that then allows us to then uplift the employee voice. So we've got proactive engagement. We do our surveys, we do our reach outs. We have multiple channels, whether it's texting to our intranet, to our Yammer, lots of ways to reach out. And then we position those voices to then attract more talent. So as we get through that, we're building this advocacy, right? We've got our allies at the table helping advocate. We've got our employees who have been elevated and amplifying those voices to really tell their stories so people want to come work for Sodexo. And then again, being on panels like this, so you hear those stories and you learn from them. So we have our ambassadors out in the field. And then we respond to the needs of the workforce. We are a very decentralized organization. We operate in 60+ countries, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of frontline employees. So making sure that they feel safe and protected as well. And again, operating in all those countries to make sure we have the right level of protections and how do we localize it. And then finally, really making sure that we have those allyship training opportunities. So they are our biggest advocates. They tend to be the largest portion of our Pride EBRGs. So making sure they have the tools that they can use and have those real life examples to understand, like you mentioned, in 70 countries, it's still an issue. People don't understand even in the US. They're like, well, you can get married, it's great. You can still get evicted. You can still have other consequences. We don't have those, the Equality Act is what's going to really reinforce that. So then helping them understand why allyship is important. So we talk about go deep, wide, and inside out. We've tried to infuse that across all the layers of the organization and all of our disciplines, whether it's an executive sponsor, a frontline employee, or an EBRG person, to make sure we have the right level of connectivity to influence through those decisions.
Great. So, really sort of doing it top down, bottom out, bottom up, middle out, and ensuring that you have all the communications and across a very geographically dispersed organization, and getting enough champions that can speak about this and are visibly out to be, create that safe space for employees. Great, thank you. So Erica, one of the things that organizations really struggle with is sort of this self-ID when it comes to sexual orientation, right? So one of the principles in my book is know what matters and count it. And, I talk a little bit about what IBM has done, but you've done a really impressive job. And you offer self-ID to about 85% of your population, if I'm not mistaken. So, and I know it's been a very intentional process. So can you speak to what you've done and what you've found through that process? Because I think people struggle with, how do I figure out how many LGBTQ employees I have? So if you can speak to that.
Really happy to do so, Rohini. So yes, you're right. It is 85% of our employees across 40 countries. And we are in over 100 countries. We operate in over 100 countries, but for all the reasons that you stated earlier in the call, we have countries where, there are criminal consequences. We have countries where, the nature of the privacy laws make it so that, it doesn't work. So it's constantly shifting, and we have to stay vigilant on it, but that's where we're at right now. So we implemented self-identification in 2006. And I think what I want to leave this group with is I really respect how challenging if you don't have self-identification at your company now, how challenging it is, right? And I say that because getting to the 2006 self-identification was a long journey. And it really started with the values of our corporation. Elizabeth knows this well, others know this well, but IBM has a long history in the space of diversity and inclusion. It's really rooted in our, one of our core values, which is trust and personal responsibility in relationships. And diversity and inclusion is a core part of that. And the evidence of that exists in something we call policy letter number 4. From 1953, which way preceded any legal requirement to have equal opportunity and non-discrimination across multiple sort of social categories. And so I will say in 1984, sexual orientation was added to that list of social categories. In the 80s and the 90s, we had an employee activist group, advocacy, but I like the word activist group called High Tech Gaze that really pushed the organization. I heard someone else say I think Rohini, it was you, stakeholders were really started pulling and requiring from their leadership change. That's the right change for human rights and for inclusion. And they were active in the 80s and the 90s. And by the time we got to 1995, the company set up 8 executive task forces, which are now reflected as executive councils. But the whole point of that was to say, okay, we need to make sure that we're actively listening to our employees, and we've built that into our organization, our leadership, our processes. And I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand how long it took and how much it took to get to that. In 1996 was when domestic partner benefits were granted by IBM. Right. And in 2002, gender identity and expression were added into the non-discrimination and equal opportunity policies. All of that work, including an awareness starting in the 80s around self-identification as a tool, and much talk and much advocacy around it, led us to the point where they say luck is like a combination of, what is it? It's like timing and preparation, right? When all of that comes together. And so in 2005 and 2006, we had a global HR system redesign. Became an amazing opportunity, and we were able to leverage that opportunity to take all of that preparation and actually implement self-ID into our systems, which was really the start of our self-ID process. That's the how.
That's great, Erica. Do you have any insights about how it was received in different parts of the world, or did you have to? I'm sure there was sort of education and training that went along with it in terms of getting people on board, but any insights on that?
Yes, I mean, I would say, I love self ID as part of this, global local conversation because um, the fact that it existed and that it was implemented was a reflection of the global values, which is what
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth mentioned. But the implementation and execution had to be local
Right.
for all the reasons we've all been stating. So um, there were countless behind the scenes conversations, attorneys,
Mm-hmm.
HRs, in Europe, employee councils, you name it, local. And that's how we landed with these are the countries that will allow employees to self ID. And then once you get to the place where you've got it, then you've got to communicate it and you have to promote it. And that, I think, is sort of a transition to the what we found. And what
Mm-hmm.
we found once we implemented it is that self-identification is not one and done. You
That's
don't
right.
turn it on and woohoo, we have self-ID and we're done. No, absolutely not. It is self-ID. You opt in, you can opt out. And so that has been a key learning since
Mm-hmm.
2006 is that we constantly have to promote it. We promoted it initially, we promoted it locally, globally, but we have to continue that focus. We do blogs, we do trainings that we will release on our global learning platform. We have to remind people, make the benefits clear. What's in it for me to self-ID? And it has to go beyond being counted. That's very important. And I think there is a selling point there, right? Because we treasure what we measure. We can respond to and advocate for what we count. But it has to go beyond. And we have to be transparent about who can access the data and what we do with it. And we do that and we attend to it. And we also make it clear that we leverage this data for mentoring and for leadership progression. And I am a product of that process. Absolutely 100%. And it's such a pleasure to be on the other side and really feed the system that I feel like I benefited from. So I could go on for a long time, but let me pause there and see if you have follow-ups.
No, this is great. I think, the key piece around the transparency and the trust, right? Because what are you doing with this data? And to be able to, ensure that you're building that trust, because in many parts of the world, it's not safe, and in both the local environment, but also the organizational environment. And I think the other thing that you said is, I like the way you built this whole piece up, because this takes time to get to the self-ID piece. It doesn't just happen. You have to have that culture that, nurtures it. So it takes time and you cannot take your foot off the pedal. But the other piece I'm also hearing from all of your presentations is, this is, I talk about it being sort of change happens at the intersection of the personal and the systems, right? It's people and systems. So you are impacting change agents and allies as people, and you have to also impact the systems. So I think, this is great. And what I'd like to do is to sort of pivot to sort of the external environment and use Zach in terms of, we talked about sort of the benefits have to be clear, right? And you had sort of started to talk about how you've sort of embedded it within how J&J does its business. If you can speak to sort of developing the change rationale, how you've embedded the LGBTQ equity piece into your business strategy, healthcare, addressing healthcare disparities, and the initiative that you talked about.
Absolutely, thank you. The seed for the idea for our Open Labs program was really inspired by Johnson & Johnson's Our Race to Health Equity commitment, right? Johnson & Johnson made a bold commitment to addressing racial health inequities in the US and around the world, noting that it is something that we have unique responsibility for as a healthcare company, but also that it is good for our overall mission of trying to improve the health of humanity for all, and all means all. That means health equity. And so inspired by that, we spent a little bit of time within our employee resource group asking how might we help address LGBTQ health equity as one of the things that our 4,000 plus members could contribute meaningfully to. And we saw a couple of things. So one, there were some pretty compelling statistics demonstrating unique healthcare needs and healthcare inequities experienced by LGBTQ folks where we have business expertise. For instance, the LGBTQ community smokes at a rate that is 50 to 100% higher than their non-LGBTQ counterparts. Johnson & Johnson, through our Nicorette business around the world, is one of the leading scientific and healthcare experts in smoking cessation, helping people in their quit journey. We saw similar data points in business areas that include oncology and in mental health and in HIV, many data points. And we thought, well, wait a minute, if we have this global scale and reach as a business, and we have this really passionate, engaged employee community of people of all different skill sets, all different lived experiences, different backgrounds, and we're committed to addressing health equity as a healthcare company, how can we then make a difference? So we launched this internal innovation incubator called Open and Out Labs that partners with our businesses in kind of an advisory capacity. So when we're talking about smoking cessation, for instance, we have a team of people at J&J who are LGBTQ, who are former smokers, who have been affected by smoking in their lives, who have been on the quit journey themselves. They're partnering with Nicorette, and our Nicorette business in the UK, they're very interested in understanding how to better serve the LGBTQ population. Thankfully, in many places around the world, there are declining populations of smokers year after year. That's a good thing. But in the LGBTQ community, there is a higher, more intractable population of smokers. How do we, with our lived experience, our professional expertise in smoking cessation, help to develop unique insights and unique interventions that can speak to the psychosocial needs of LGBTQ smokers, the different risk factors, the stressors, the fact that LGBTQ folks might use smoking to help build social bonds or social relationships, or as a crutch for mental health challenges or needs or anxieties. So we're working to help inform business thinking, but from a place of deep lived experience and proximity to the communities that we've served. And so we're showing our business, well, yes, this is like a nice to do. It's a good thing for our employee population here, but it's also a business value driver. We're going to strengthen not just reputation, but bottom line for our smoking cessation business by helping them better reach LGBT smokers in their quit journey. And at the same time, we're addressing that health equity kind of social value proposition, and our LGBTQ employees have a very meaningful way to contribute their experiences and their skill sets to something that they care about. We're working with teams to build it into goals and objectives. We have job descriptions written for roles on these project teams. So it's not just a thing that you do between 5 and 7 p.m. on your free time. We're helping people build this into what they're being held accountable for. It is something that is helping to strengthen our businesses and will be measured for the folks that participate as one of their contributions to our business, in addition to our culture and our commitment to DEI. So scaling this up and looking at all different kinds of ways that we might be able to affect change in different parts of the LGBTQ community.
That is awesome. I can hear the passion. This is your thing. This is awesome. So I'm going to ask you to send me a write-up on this because I have to see this.
I will. I'll pop it in the chat box if folks are interested in reading more about it.
Please, this is phenomenal. It really is about how you address issues of equity and embed it into your business model to impact the bottom line of the business. So just a phenomenal example. We know it's the right thing to do, right? And this is how it's going to benefit the business. So it's just fantastic. So thank you for that example. And Elizabeth, you had talked about CEOs being much bolder, and you're absolutely right. I think it's taken some pretty disturbing things, death of Black men and women, to get many CEOs and leaders there. And we shouldn't have to rely on those kinds of situations, right? But one of the things when you and I talked about, we talked about this principle that I have, leaders change should lead change. And you talked about how leaders, have to have an epiphany to get anything to change. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of leaders who are bolder now and are taking a stand, but have had this sort of disruption of their worldview? And you actually use the word epiphany, sort of to get there. So can you speak a little bit more, give some more texture to that? And you're muted.
Thanks, Rohini. what I used to do, I was an executive and a lawyer at Apple Computer. And this is in the 80s. I would go, when I had a business meeting somewhere like, I don't know, Kodak, I would fit in, you know, a speech or working with their nascent ERG or whatever. And so I would fit in these advocacy moments in the nooks and crannies of my business travel.
Mhm.
So I ended up having a front row seat to a variety of executives, CEOs, who would go, something would crack open in their heart and brain and they would get it. And it was like an epiphany. But I have to say, in most situations, having it be about the business was not the core force operating in them. It was often an employee they had not realized was LGBTQ, but had been particularly innovative and brilliant and contributed somehow to the business. And more times than not, it was a family member.
Mhm.
So I remember working with George Fisher at Kodak. It was one of the first companies. He was an extraordinary leader. He came out of Motorola. He had no particular reason to have any sort of empathy or affinity for LGBTQ issues. But lo and behold, and I believe I actually met her, there was a little girl, his daughter, running around. Well, she grew up and turned out to be lesbian. So you never know what forces, you know, are operating inside a CEO's life. Probably the most profound epiphany I observed was John Scully. I was head of litigation at Apple. John Scully had come in to be CEO. And honestly, he had been advised several times not to do any of the policies, not doing domestic partner coverage, and so on and so forth. And then I watched him come into a room. I was the lawyer, so I was helping. Bennett Marks was one of the key leaders on staff. And I watched as John Scully had an epiphany in the room, and he just reversed the company position. About 100 people were there. It was a watershed moment. And that is the first epiphany a CEO can have. And again, it's not just driven by business issues. The second epiphany we have to watch for in our time is when there is a final realization that racism and many of these issues are rooted in systemic problems.
Mm-hmm.
And when they have a systemic epiphany that, oh my God, we can have how many racial justice town halls about George Floyd, but until you are willing to change the system from top to bottom, that systemic material is going to keep coursing through the bowels of any organization. And so now we're looking for a more sophisticated form of transformation in CEOs. And I do believe it's an essential ingredient. It's not a nice to have. You have to have that as one of the primary ingredients in this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're absolutely right on several fronts. One is it's eventually to really internalize the benefit and to get it in your gut. It's not necessarily the business case and data. It is, you know, it oftentimes is those stories, those lived experiences of people that are, you know, they care for, that make the difference. But I think the caution is, you know, that CEOs and our leaders have to take responsibility for their own learning, because they have to understand the toll it takes for someone with a lived experience to share, sometimes again and again and again, and really have to maximize the impact of that and use it with caution. So, and then I think you're right about the systemic piece, because, you know, as I said, change happens at the intersection of people and systems. It has to be both and, otherwise it doesn't work. So awesome stuff.
Yeah, and Rohini, in your book, you did mention a very specific example.
Mhm.
That was you gaining the trust and vice versa of the African American leaders at Sodexo. Of
Mhm.
course, it wasn't their job to educate you, but it was sure strategic to educate you and back and forth. So while yes, there is that thing we all say to each other that it's nobody's job to educate sort of the oppressor. The fact is, it's a really good idea once in a while to take that risk because change can emanate. So.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to ask two more questions, and if we could sort of, keep them, I could just literally go on. This panel could be another hour. There's so much rich information here. But I'm going to ask two questions, one of AJ and then one of Erica, and then I'm going to ask each of you for a closing thought. So you can be thinking about that, either closing thought in terms of advice for those of you doing global LGBTQ equity work, or anything else you'd like to share in terms of the ERG work that you've been doing. So, but AJ, going to you, again, at Sodexo have done an amazing job of creating disruptive experiences. I mean, I remember the transgender webinar and how, the CEO was just so incredibly moved. But can you just speak a little bit to that in terms of how you've sort of done that at Sodexo?
Yeah, so Rohini, it's a fantastic point, right? It goes back to that building the allyship and making sure we've got the right connectivity with all of our leaders. We tried to make sure we had programming that was relatable and those bite-sized pieces that they can take those nuggets of value and then use them in their personal lives, use them in their leadership roles. So we've done things like P-Flag Straight for Equality, where we really try to have that foundational experience to build allyship. And to your point, we had some great feedback from CEOs who said, this is incredible, and I need to do more to be an active ally. I need to be an upstander, not just a bystander. I need to do things to help elevate those conversations. We had great lived experiences. One of our former SVPs of communication told their personal story around how their child identified as transgender and came out to them, and that whole life journey, because it was never it didn't affect that family, and all of a sudden it did. And then the network groups became a cornerstone in how they grew, and it came into their family. And then we got to learn and be a part of that journey as well. And it created those true experiences where it's authentic and people can relate and say, this is so important and why. It could happen to any family. And then we did, I think those other pieces, Rohini, around the LGBTQ conversation guide that you were a part of when you were here, and our LGBTQ plus 101, how we built that and gave it as a framework. So Zach, going back to how you guys talked about, distributing those assets around the world from a communication standpoint, we built the same model. Here's the framework. Here's the US-centric one. We recognize it's US-centric, but now distill that down into your region, into your country, to make sure it's appropriate, because the language barrier in and of itself of what we can email and share is one of those challenges. And how do you adapt it just in flight? Our language is evolving so quickly. The terminology, the glossary is so rapidly evolving that we need to make sure we had that right framework. And then really that last part was building the next generation of leaders. We've really tried to instill our own grassroots version of self-ID. We're very early on in our journey of self-ID, but where are we doing that from our talent acquisition? What are we doing that from our global surveys, our pulse surveys? We reach out to every employee, frontline through management. So we're trying to build some of those metrics so we can be counted. And then we use that to then articulate why it's so important that we're building allyship, why it's so important that we're building transgender resources, why it's so important we're focusing on LGBTQ plus initiatives. And it all starts with the everyday, whether it's the impact on the individuals, the society, the planet. We're really trying to make sure that our DE&I piece is embedded in everything that we do, because we touch so many consumers across the world. You may not know who Sodexo is, but you've probably come in contact with us one way or the other. So, Rohini, it's those disruptive experiences that really line up on everything that we do. And it could be the most minute thing to these big watershed moments, like I heard from some of the rest of the team. But we're trying to make sure that we're present and we're a part of the conversation.
That's great. And you're so right that a lot of this spills into your personal life, right? The example that you shared about the mother of a transgender child. I mean, I remember this one senior leader who actually was a sponsor of Global Pride and went home and was wearing a lanyard with Pride on it. And her daughter came out to her and said, okay, now that you're a sponsor, I think it may be safe for me to share, that I'm gay. I mean, so this has that spillover and she says, this would never have happened if I wasn't a sponsor. So it's those sort of epiphanies that Elizabeth talked about, which, so Erica, I'm going to ask you this last question, and maybe you can segue to any sort of closing thoughts as well. But the last question around, going deep, wide, and inside out, and really embedding this in your systems. So if you can just share, what you're doing and holding leaders accountable, and then a closing thought, and we'll go to the others on that.
That's great. I love that you're forcing me to be super, super concise. So I will do that, because I do think we can have an entire session on this principle, and I love this principle. And I think that leading off in the discussion with the self-ID, we kind of talked about that, right? Like we got the self-ID because of the go deep, wide, and inside out. We wouldn't have gotten there without it. So what I will use this time with is to just point out some of the different aspects within IBM that's evidence of that, and the accountability. So I think it starts at the top. So it starts at the CEO level, and the CEO showing up and representing our D&I values, and being willing and being activist and being willing to be the face of policies, policy statements, statements in response to horrific things happening around the world, including in the space of LGBTQ plus, laws or statements or things that happen. So there is a requirement that our council be sponsored by a senior vice president. And that senior vice president has the responsibility to be a true sponsor, not just a supporter, right? That means lending their networks, their credibility, their executive capital, if you will, to what we call the vital few. And I remember Zach talking about, being really focused, and we have to do that. We have to be very focused. We actually call our initiatives the vital few. The vital few has a whole organization around it. We have a group called the Out Role Models. We have our Out Executives. Our Out Role Models are leaders of those vital few initiatives. Our Out Executives are sponsors of those initiatives. Each of those initiatives have a set of goals and outcomes that are measured. And then those measurements become KPIs that contribute to so here's the accountability piece, that contribute to our annual IBM Diversity and Inclusion report, public report. So there is this, working internally with all the levels of support, and then this very external reporting against the progress that we're making that helps to get everybody focused on the right activities and the right investments. There are many other pieces. I'll just call them out. We have a diversity marketplace team. They engage with our clients on our diversity inclusion know-how, assets, approaches, BRGs, of course, but a very strong diversity and inclusion team, global team with an officer. Sometimes there are chief diversity officers, but they don't have any support within organizations. In this case, there's a whole organization and structure that supports. And then drives all the way down to things like every single manager globally has to take training in anti-bullying that incorporates issues of, sexual orientation, gender identity, and representation. So it just to give you a taste of levels and global. I think my closing thought would be every step matters. Every step matters. I started by saying the challenge was you're volunteering and it's a lot. But every step you take matters and helps move the work forward.
It becomes a ripple effect. Thank you for that. Zach, closing thought from you?
Yes, communicators love things in threes, so I'll give a three-part little short example. First, be bold, right? Claim your seat at the table. And especially if you're a member of the LGBTQ family in your organization, you have colleagues and communities who are waiting for someone to claim that seat at a table and be the voice for the community. So be bold. The second piece is to be collaborative, that while we globally are an LGBT employee resource group and a Latinx employee resource group and an African, there are values and objectives around belonging, culture, and community that we all share. And when we collaborate across an organization or between organizations, we can accomplish much more than if it's just an individual group. And the third is to be a co-conspirator. If you're not part of the LGBTQIA community, we love you too, but don't just be an ally, be a co-conspirator. Help to be an agent thinking of strategic change. And even if you are part of the community, I'm a gay white man. There are many folks in our community that have different lived experiences from my own that are even further excluded from conversations, from privilege, and from the table where decisions are made. And so we need to each be co-conspirators for each other, even within our own community.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. AJ?
Those are two hard ones to follow because as I was jotting down notes, you guys covered both of them. And there's, I think, going back to that being wide across the organization, it's chipping away at every little piece. So every little thing that you do does count, and really broadening your network, right? Our Pride Network group, our leadership teams are diverse groups. That's how we got a little bit of our self-ID started with our talent acquisition team. One of our chair people sits in that department. So do spread out your teams, reach out to seek to understand, and Zach, spot on really understanding those lived experiences, because I too come from a very similar place of privilege, and I lean on my team to help me understand and to grow. So I've grown a lot from my team. I encourage you to seek out different thoughts and opinions, and really, go to those intersectional conversations with your peer groups, because our community does spread all these other groups. So I'll pass over to Elizabeth at this point.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Oh. Yeah, I guess my best closing piece of advice is, if you're in the role of Chief Diversity Officer or HR, or any of those key roles, make sure you're forging a relationship with the CEO to prepare for the worst. So you don't want to walk in and say, our gay employee in Egypt is now in prison. Can we hire local counsel? You have to run these drills over the years and be ready to have to act. And we're in a dangerous world.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about all of you, but it's feeling like 1933 to me.
Mm-hmm.
The stakes are only going to get more dangerous, more acute. And I can certainly see companies having to grapple with life and death issues at the local level, various settings around the world. So make sure your CEO is prepared to be brave in the moment, and that may take some rehearsal.
Awesome. So every step counts. Be bold, be collaborative, co-conspirators, broaden your network, keep learning, and seek out intersectional experiences, and forge relationships to be prepared for the worst. You're absolutely right. Even in the United States, this is not about just outside the United States, because things are getting worse by the minute. So excellent. This was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you all. As I said, I could have gone on for another 2 hours, but I need to hand over to Edie Frazier, Miss Edie Frazier. Thank you all very, very much. This was enlightening. I've taken copious notes, so I'm going to reach back to all of you. Thank you. Edie?
Jeannie, can we just thank the four, to Zach and Elizabeth and Erica and AJ? You are four of the most articulate champions of change. So for everyone that has been part of this, and for the recording that we want to get to millions, thank you for your bold leadership, because we've all learned a lot. But you do say, be bold, be brave, and that the stakes are high, and the CEO leadership. And I think, Erica, as you started saying and Ask Rohini, you've got a day job and a gay job. We need it to be everybody's job. And you've all given examples of the best business case of why, from the CEO all the way to customers, that we are embracing and standing up. And as you just said, Elizabeth, we need to take the offensive and not the defensive. And all four of you have given brilliant examples. So Rohini, I turn it back to you and just say, this has been awesome for all of us. And there is no one that should not be an advocate as you broaden out and realize value of the best and the most brilliant but leaderships that we've got, which is exemplified by the four of you. Rohini?
No, just want to thank everyone. I think this was a spectacular conversation and hope that we'll continue. I know that Heidi and others would like to close this out. I believe that's what I'm supposed to do, is to hand it back to you to wrap up.
Yes.
We have a couple of calls coming up, but we will have the recording out, and thank you again to the panelists. I really appreciate it. And I will say that, I shared those 5 principles in my book, and you brought them to life with your story. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Wonderful, Rohini. Before we close, just one last question from me, because I'm really curious. After your book release, I would be curious to understand, because I know that you got a huge wave of response to your book release, and everybody wants a little piece of you. What's sort of the #1 topic that people came back to you where they wanted to go deeper?
Yeah, I think the #1, so I think, it's interesting because I think people found it, I think Elizabeth said when we were having this offline conversation, they found it very practical, and you mentioned it, Heidi,
Yes.
Found it very practical. I think the one area, and if you ask me, what was my one regret, right? My one regret really was that I did not go deeper in anti-racism work outside of the United States. And I think that's the area where I think people would want to see more and would want me to go deeper. And I do share a lot of examples in there, particularly in Europe. And you know better than anyone, Heidi, the context in Europe, in France, and Anya, of course, and Johanna, all 3 of you, that, in France, for instance, I work for a French company. The word race was struck out of the French Constitution in 2018. You cannot gather data, and there are historical reasons for that. It comes out of World War II, and France wanting to recreate itself as one nation, unified, and not allowing people to gather information about religion or race or ethnicity that the state could then use against its citizens, as countries had done during World War II against the Jewish population. So that's the genesis of it. But then how do you enter this dialogue? Because we can all see that issues of race and racism exist regardless of where you are. Sometimes it's entangled with other identities, like ethnicity or caste or religion, that play more of a prominent role than does race. And if we approach it with the US lens, where race is the defining dimension, then I think we may miss some of those entry points, like the ethnic conflicts in Uganda, or discrimination against different castes and religious minorities in India. So I think the issue in Europe, where the way we entered this dialogue was through the refugee piece, which becomes it's sort of coming full circle, right? Now you can see the refugees from Ukraine and the discrimination that Edie started off with, right? We are intersectional beings, and there is discrimination against Ukrainians of color who have lived in Ukraine for many, many years, right? So I think we know it exists. And the way we entered this conversation was through the refugee dimension, because refugees are religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And it provides an entry point to the conversation, but I think we can and should be doing more. And I skimmed the surface in the book. So that was a fantastic question, Heidi, because in terms of what people would like to see more, I think that's the one that they would like to see unpacked more in terms of how one can make more inroads. So let me just stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rohini.
Heidi, if I might just say from WBC, we all are taking megaphones for change. And we are so thrilled tomorrow to have WBC ring the New York Stock Exchange bell for parity and diversity for the first time. So that will be 3:55. You can dial in and see CNBC and see it live, but together. And on Tuesday, we're putting out with the Business Roundtable a release that will be so major as the Roundtable CEOs speak out for disclosure of data and for leadership on gender equality and diversity. So just be with us as we push that bold and brave envelope as exemplified by you today. Heidi?
Yeah, wonderful closing words, Edie. And I think it's a wonderful testimony that WBC has become, I would say, the authority in the D&I space. So, you know, it's amazing that WBC gets to ring the New York City Stock Exchange closing bell tomorrow, the collaboration with the Business Roundtable, the fact that so many large global companies, like the speakers today, the speakers last time, the speakers for the upcoming two events, all big global companies, are willing to be transparent, share their learnings, their pain points. That is true collaboration. I think, AJ, you said it. We need to continue to collaborate, because collaborating together, companies of this scale across the world will make the world a better place. And there has at no time been a better time to make the world a better place. So thank you for all of you for being transparent and helping us to further many, many causes. We talked about LGBT plus today. On June 5, we're going to have a deep dive session on race and ethnicity, also with for amazing speakers. And of course, Rohini always being our subject matter expert. And October 21, we're going to go deep on disabilities, how to localize a global disability strategy. So thank you for everybody for taking the time. 90 minutes is a long time. We're used to 60-minute meetings, but unlike Rohini, I could have listened to this quote for another hour. So thank you so much, and all stay safe, and good luck tomorrow, Edie. Bye-bye.
Thank you.